Hazel trees, alongside oak, ash and yew, are often considered one of the big four trees. Hazel is considered as both a protector and a marker for sacred places, and it also appears as a tree in sacred groves. While some debate that it's actually a shrub, we're going to consider it as a tree in this episode, because we're going to have a look at both its mythical and its magical side in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. I hope that your September has been a good one, because we are of course into the final weekend of September and it really does feel like autumn is finally setting in. If you did listen last week, you'll know that I was having some trials and tribulations with my laptop, which I'm pleased to say have now been repaired, so I'm back on my lovely, nice, fast, lightning quick computer, making this a lot easier. Anyway, I'm going to crack on because obviously no one's really interested in my IT problems. And we are finishing off Folklore of Deciduous Trees month with the Hazel tree, which was actually a request by one of my lovely Patreon supporters. Incidentally, I am also going to be doing a short exclusive article on the folklore of the birch tree for my Patreon supporters at any level. So that means it doesn't matter what tier you're at, you will get at least one exclusive article every month going forwards, written by me. So we are going to crack on with the folklore of hazel trees, because that is, after all, why you are here. And like I said in the introduction, hazel trees are considered one of the big four alongside oak, ash and yew. And Nicholas Culpeper actually classified the hazel as a plant of Mercury, while William Lilly assigned it to Jupiter. Now, according to Christina Oakley Harrington, Mercury's caduceus was made of hazel, and that's the rod with the snakes around it that you sometimes see him pictured with, and apparently so was Kirker's wand. Now, the tree's links with Mercury, I feel, make quite a lot of sense, given Mercury's role as the god of intelligence and communication, and this does reflect the association between Hazel and Wisdom that we're going to come back to later. Again, I also said in the introduction that hazel appears as a tree in sacred groves, and Sylvanus Calirius, the god of the hazelwood, was worshipped in Colchester, and this does indeed show us a mythical side of the tree. Now, we're going to start off with the hazel and folklore, and surprisingly enough, the hazel tree actually symbolised communication, epiphanies and creative inspiration in the Victorian language of flowers, and it did also represent reconciliation as well. Now, in modern Scots Gaelic, a hazel grove is a caltain, and Druidry.org note that places called Calton can actually be considered entrances to the underworld due to the derivation of Calton from the Scots Gaelic term. Now, this obviously does certainly put a slightly different spin on Calton Hill in Edinburgh, and if you do any of the ghost walks that go around the Calton Hill area, they will no doubt tell you all about the fairy stories that they have associated with the area. Now, also according to Druidry.org, hazel trees are still found near holy wells in Ireland and Britain, and the website also relates a legend that Joseph of Arimathea used hazel branches to build the first Glastonbury Abbey. In one old custom, the 14th of September was Holy Cross Day, and children got the day off school to collect nuts, although this custom understandably died out with the First World War. Nutcrack Night in November marked the day when people opened their stored nuts. Now, I should point out that that is what the Trees for Life website says, whereas on Druidry.org, they note that Nutcrack Night was actually Halloween, and this was the night on which young couples roasted hazelnuts over the fire. If the nuts burned steadily, it meant that the relationship would fare well, but if the nuts flew apart, it spelled doom. And we all know how much I love a little bit of divination by strange object on this podcast, and I do think that burning nuts is a really interesting way to decide if your relationship's going to last or not. Now, this does segue nicely into the link between the hazel and love and fertility, and it was once a tradition to give brides hazelnuts on their wedding day to pass on wisdom, fertility and good fortune. And in Devon, this particular job fell to an old woman who would wait outside the church to greet the bride with a basket of hazelnuts. Now, this isn't so surprising when you learn that hazelnuts were linked with love, fertility, birth, knowledge and poetry. A Somerset belief noted that plenty of catkins, plenty of prams, linking the tree with population booms. And according to one belief, if girls collected nuts on a Sunday, they would meet the devil and be pregnant on their wedding day. Now, we should bear in mind that going nutting and gathering nuts were also euphemisms for lovemaking, so it's entirely possible that girls collecting nuts in the woods on their own were not exactly encountering the devil, shall we say. But girls might even use hazelnuts to identify their future husband. So they would assign the names of potential partners to different hazelnuts and then throw them into the fire. Whichever nut gave the loudest pop or the brightest flame indicated the best prospect for her. And this kind of link does go back centuries, because according to Margaret Baker, the Romans even burned torches of hazel on the wedding night to bring happiness to the new couple. But there is a darker side to the link between love and hazel trees, because boys in Wales might signify that they'd changed their mind about a girl or that they wanted to break an engagement by giving her a hazel stick. I can't help thinking that just sitting down and having a conversation about it would be a much better option, but there we go, this is folklore for you. Now, I did mention earlier that there was a link between hazels and wisdom, and in Ireland, 9 hazel trees surrounded the Well of Life. The nuts fell into the water, creating what are known as bubbles of mystic inspiration, and anyone who ate the nuts became seers and poets. Now, according to the Trees for Life website, a salmon ate the hazelnuts from these trees, and in one particular legend, a druid envied the salmon's wisdom and caught it. He tasked his apprentice with cooking the salmon, but the apprentice wasn't to eat any of it. However, while he was cooking, some of the juices spattered the apprentice's thumb, which were obviously hot, so he put his thumb into his mouth to try and ease the pain. But of course, he then imbibed some of the wisdom from the salmon, and thus became incredibly wise himself. And this apprentice was Finn McCool. Now, Niall McCoytier actually relates a Scottish version of this story, and in this version, the apprentice is a man named Farquhar. He's directed to catch a white snake that emerges from a hazel bush and then boil it in a pot, which seems a little bit unfair, but there we go. And during the process, he uses his finger to block some of the steam that emerges from the pot. When Farquhar then sucks the water from his finger, he gains the knowledge of all medicine. This does indeed really rather annoy the doctor who directed him to do it in the first place, because the doctor was hoping to learn all the knowledge himself. Now, this link between the snake and medicinal knowledge does make a lot of sense when we think of the myths around Asclepius, and the Greek-Roman god of medicine learned some of his trade from an injured snake that he cured, according to one of the myths. So it's quite interesting that we then get this link between hazel and snakes, which we will come back to later on in this episode. But we are going to move on instead to one of the more famous links with hazel, and that is with both divining and magic. Now, hazel was a favoured wood for divining rods, and Ruth Binney advises that what you would do is you would cut a 45cm forked branch, and then you'd hold the prongs between your thumb and first 2 fingers. So obviously that's each hand has a prong of this forked branch, and the joint should point downwards. Slowly walk across the ground that you're searching and pay attention to what the branch does. It should rise of its own accord near water and then actually bend backwards, possibly even breaking when you get over a spring. Now, for best success, you should cut your rod between sunset and sunrise on a new moon. I do think it's quite interesting that you do have this link between hazel and water when you consider the story we've just looked at, with the idea of the hazel being around holy wells and sacred springs and so on. Now, you could also use hazel rods for other forms of divination, and according to Alexander Porteus, people in Europe would throw hazel rods into the air and they would draw their omens from the direction in which the rods fell, whether that was sort of like left, right, forwards or backwards, and so on. It's quite a rudimentary method, but apparently it worked. Now, I did mention magic and the hazel, and hazel was pretty much the favourite wood for magic wands, and if you cut them at sunrise, that actually gave them a boost of solar energy. Now, Harrington recommends cutting your magical hazel at sunrise on a Wednesday, which is very specific, and obviously the Wednesday links again with this idea of the tree being a tree of Mercury, and Wednesday is his day. A Scottish tip further advises that you shouldn't cut hazel, or willow for that matter, during a waning moon, because this would leave the wood too dry and brittle. You could also carry a hazel rod 1.5 fathoms long with a green hazel twig pushed into it, and this would cast invisibility over the holder. Now, I had no idea how long a fathom was, so I did Google it because obviously that's what I do. And a fathom is approximately 1.8 metres, so that would be a rod that would be 2.7 metres long. How you'd manage to be invisible while carrying a length of wood that long, I'm not sure, so if you do try it, please do let me know if it works. But a much easier option, if you want to use hazel for invisibility, is to carry hazelnuts in an orange pouch, and apparently that will help to bestow invisibility upon you, and is also, I think, much more achievable than finding a length of wood that's 2.7 meters long. If you carry double hazelnuts in your pocket, that would bring you luck and also protect against both toothache and witches. And the double nut was sometimes referred to as St. John's nut. You could weave hazel twigs together to make a crown, and if you wore this while making your wishes, it would make them more effective. Now, obviously, this pretty much depends on the fact that hazel is really flexible, so it does lend itself quite well to such an endeavour. And what I found was really interesting was that in parts of England, hazel actually formed the basis of the Maidens Garland. And this was a crown made from either hazel or again willow, which obviously we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and it was used to mark the death of a local person who had died unmarried. Now, these people were usually female, but not always, and the mourners would carry the garland above the coffin and then hang it in the church after the funeral above their pew. It was basically left there until it rotted away, although sometimes they were thrown out during church renovations. And in one description, we hear that they were essentially made of this circular hoop made out of the hazel or the willow, and then people would attach coloured paper made to look like flowers, and then a woman's glove was either cut out of white paper and hung from the middle, or an actual glove was used, and they would often write the woman's name and age on it. Earlier descriptions do talk about using real flowers as well, but the paper ones seem to have become more common. Where fresh flowers were used, they were usually lilies, and these have represented purity since early Christianity. And apparently lily wreaths used to be laid on the coffins of virgins. So as local church life changed and mourning itself altered, the tradition had almost completely died out by the 1920s. However, even Shakespeare mentions one of these maidens' garlands in Hamlet about the funeral of Ophelia, in which she is allowed her virgin krans, and krans is basically believed to come from the Old Norse word krans, meaning wreath or crown. So it does seem quite strange to see these garlands made to symbolise a person who didn't marry, made from a tree so heavily associated with love. And if those kind of mourning rituals are in any way interesting to you, I have an entire illustrated talk about them, which is available to my Patreon supporters at the £5 a month or higher level. So this is the sadder side of hazel, shall we say. But more often than not, you find them associated with protection when hazel's used in specific ways. So we've already had a look at how you can apparently render yourself invisible using both hazelnuts and branches from the tree. But there was also a belief that carrying a hazel stick would actually protect you from evil if you were walking at night. Gathering hazel twigs on Palm Sunday could protect a home from being struck by lightning or suffering from a fire. And Druidry.org actually note the links between the hazel and Thor, so this does suggest something of a Norse influence on this particular custom, in much the same way that people would put oak things out like acorns and oak leaves to try and deter lightning via the associations with Jupiter and other gods of his ilk. You see the same thing here with the hazel. Now, you could also protect your home from fire by driving 3 hazel pins into the wall of the house. If you formed a cross with 2 hazel twigs and then fastened that to the wall, it would guard the whole building against witchcraft and disease. And in Germany, you could cut a cross from hazel and then pass it over your stored corn during the first thunderstorm, and this would prevent it from going bad. If you wanted to protect yourself against fairies or serpents, and indeed this is where the link with snakes comes in, you could cut a stick of hazel before sunrise on May Day, and then you would draw a circle around yourself using this stick, and essentially neither fairies nor serpents could cross said circle. It's perhaps no surprise that many believe that the staff used by St. Patrick to drive the snakes from Ireland was actually made of hazel. And you could also stir jam with a hazel stick to stop fairies from stealing it, and tying a piece of hazel to a horse meant that the fairies couldn't steal it. And finally, sailors might even wear sprigs of hazel to protect themselves from shipwreck. So ultimately, with all of these legends and myths around using it for protection, for love, for wisdom, and all that kind of jazz, what do we make of hazel trees and their folklore? Well, ultimately, I think we can actually see why hazel trees are one of the big 4. They're associated both with foundational myths and more commonplace folklore, so it basically links them into a wider tradition of myth-making and then the folk practices of everyday life. And obviously, both of these things are entirely welcome here on Fabulous Folklore. But also, much like the hawthorn, hazel trees offer nutritious fruit, and like the oak, hazel trees also offer protection and guidance through divination, so it does kind of make them something of a super tree where folklore is concerned. But obviously you do need to be aware of some of the other folklore associated with it, so please do keep your wits about you if you decide to go collecting hazelnuts, because that helpful stranger might just be the devil in disguise. So that is the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. As I say, that is the end of Folklore of Deciduous Trees month. There will be another Folklore of Trees month in the future, because let's be honest, there's a whole ton of trees that I haven't looked at yet. But I think we've covered quite a nice balance. This month, we did also have one of the trees associated with fairies and witches and so on, so like elder trees and hawthorn and so on, so they're back in the archives. I am actually in the process of building a website for Fabulous Folklore, so I can put episodes together in playlists, so that all of the episodes about a particular thing are then kind of tied together so you can find them more easily. So that is on the cards for some time in the end of 2021. If you are a supporter over on Patreon as part of the Fabulous Folklore family, please do look out for the exclusive article about birch tree folklore, and the exclusive episode this month is going to be about psychopomps. So expect all things Mercury, Hermes, Anubis, Valkyries, that kind of thing. So that is also on its way at the end of September. That, however, as I say, is the end of both this week and this month. And next month, we're going to be having a look at basically all things ghosts, because let's be honest, it's October. What else am I going to do? So we're essentially going to have a month-long Halloween, which is just as it should be. So I hope that you have an absolutely cracking week ahead, whatever it is that you end up doing. And I will see you back here next week for some ghostly fun times on Fabulous Folklore. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.